Hello, I'm Jana from Sydney Visa. This video is part 2 of the series where I go over the state nomination requirements for all the Australian states and territories for the 2021-22 financial year. The link to the first part you will find in the description to this video, and it also should hover somewhere on the screen for you now. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that in order to be considered for an Australian state or regional nomination, an applicant first must meet the overall criteria set by Australian government. So these requirements, the criteria are: so the applicant must be younger than 45 years old, have a positive skill assessment in an occupation from a combined occupations list, need to demonstrate a minimum English requirement, which is IELTS 6, or sometimes depending on occupation could be higher, have at least 65 points in the point test, and have lodged an expression of interest through a skill select system. And only after you have done all of the above, after you have all the documents in hand, you will be considered for the state and territory nomination. That's when you can start searching for your nomination. Each state has additional requirements that also need to be satisfied on top of the above government requirement. So we'll talk about this requirements in full for each state in this video. Australian Capital Territory, or Canberra, so ACT is what we call it. ACT has received 600 more places for its skill nomination program this year compared to the last. Nominations provided to ACT are to focus on applicants that are critical to supporting COVID-19 response. This includes individuals providing critical and specialist medical services, those that have critical skills required to maintain the supply of essential goods and services, and people who deliver services in sectors that are critical to the Australian economic recovery. So the full list can be found in the link that I've placed in the description. The most places per month have been allocated to ICT specialists. To be eligible to apply for the consideration for either 190 or 491 nomination in ICT, the following criteria must be met. So for both nominations, the candidate must live and work in Canberra. To be considered for 491 application, you must have worked and lived in Canberra for at least 3 months prior to the application. In the case of 190 nomination, you need to demonstrate that you've lived in Canberra for at least 6 months, lived and worked. Your work needs to be minimum 20 hours per week for the 491 nomination, and minimum of 35 hours a week if you are aiming for 190 nomination. For both nominations, your occupation must be on the ICT Occupations List, or you are currently working on either of the short-term work visas, that's 457 or 482, or you are a businessman, a business owner in Canberra, so it's another option there. So depending on the occupation, your English level must be IELTS 7 or above. There are some occupations, level 3 occupations, that need and demonstrate IELTS 6. Canberra's skill migration program remains closed for the offshore applicants until the federal government reopens the international borders. To be considered for the ACT nomination, all candidates need to complete Canberra Matrix, which is another calculation of points that Canberra uses for its nominations. South Australia. South Australia Skill Migration program has received 2,600 places for each of the subclasses, 190 and 491, which is 1,200 more than last year. So the number of allocations is quite promising, as they stand at 5,200 spots for the combined nominations, and are only second to New South Wales. South Australia is unique in a way that unlike states like Victoria, it didn't restrict invitations to critical occupations, and the trend is likely to continue in this financial year. Another exciting news is that South Australia has a number of occupations in its list that are open for the offshore candidates. So you can see the list of those occupations on the screen now, that we have had a publication about that in our social media recently. The overall requirement for the South Australian nomination is that candidates' occupation must be on the South Australia Occupations List. Each occupation has its own requirements for the 190 and the 491 nomination. So please refer to the list, find your occupation and just check what the requirement for your profession is. Queensland. Queensland has received the same number of places as last year, so it's about 1,000 for 190 and 1,250 for the 491. But the state is currently still finalising the criteria for its skill nomination program and remains closed until further notice. Tasmania. Tasmania has received 1,100 places for the subclass 190 and 2,200 places for the subclass 491, which is slightly more than last year. Although Tasmania has published its own Tasmanian occupation list, it actually considers other occupations. So basically, if you have been working in Tasmania in any occupation for at least 6 months, you might be considered for either 190 or 491 nomination. If your occupation is on a Tasmanian occupation list, then having been employed in Tasmania for 3 months would be sufficient. Tasmania is another state that accepts nomination applications from overseas applicants, but only overseas applicants are only considered for the regional nomination 491. There are 2 categories that the overseas applicants can apply for. So one is the TSOL requirement. So TSOL is the acronym for the Tasmanian Skill Occupation List. To be considered for this path, your nominated occupation should be listed in this list. So unless your occupation is listed as in high demand in the list, then you will need to provide evidence that there are sufficient employment opportunities for you in Tasmania and that you have a reasonable prospects of employment related to your occupation. If your occupation is in a high demand and you meet the specified requirements, then employability evidence is not required. Again, each occupation on the list has its own requirements, so please refer to the list to check those. From time to time, in response to the industry demand, Migration Tasmania may invite and nominate candidates who do not have an occupation listed in their list. So the candidates with a non-Tasmanian list occupation may lodge an expression of interest for Tasmanian nomination. However, there is obviously no guarantee they'll be invited to apply. Another path for the Tasmanian nomination for the offshore applicants is the job offer requirement. So basically, if you received a formal job offer for a job that is based in Tasmania, that is in your nominated occupation, then you might be considered for the 491 Tasmanian nomination. Last but not least is the Northern Territory. The Australian jurisdiction with the smallest skill nominated program has been allocated 1,000 places total, with 500 for each subclass visas, and it's the same as the previous year. Northern Territory has 2 pathways for the Northern Territory residents. So it's a graduate pathway. It's for those candidates who have completed their 2-year study in Northern Territory. If the candidate had lived in Northern Territory in the last 6 months continuously after completing their study there, then they can be considered for 190 visa. Otherwise, only 491 nomination will be offered. Also, if you have been living in the Northern Territory for at least 2 years prior to your application, then you can be considered for 190 nomination. And to be considered for 491 nomination, the candidate needs to demonstrate that they've lived and worked in Northern Territory for the last 12 months. The occupation for both pathways does not need to be on the Northern Territory occupation list, but it needs to be at least on the general DHA list. Interestingly, Northern Territory will not consider applicants that reside in other states in Australia at all, or who have dependents or part of the family, immediate family living in other states. Northern Territory also considers overseas applications who would be only able to get original nomination. So offshore applicants must have been employed in their nomination occupation for at least 12 months out of the last 24, and it obviously can be overseas, doesn't have to be in Australia, and have a relevant Australian qualification. So offshore applicants must have an offer of full-time employment in Northern Territory if the Northern Territory Immigration Occupation List requires it. Again, go back to the list, have a look and check your occupation if it is on it and what the requirements are. This is it for now. I'm hoping this was informative. If you have any questions, please you can ask them here and in the comment section below on YouTube. If you like assistance with your nomination search and nomination application, please email us at email@sydneyvisa.com.au and we'll be able to help you. Cheers from down under. Goodbye.